on camera.
Good for you for wearing them.
Oh, I hate them. I was supposed to be done, and then I said, oh, I think you could do a few more.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
Okay. Let us open with prayer. Blessed Lord, you have caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning. Grant that we may so hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that by patience and comfort of your holy word we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, so we started talking about Abram. We were looking at Genesis 12 last week. And I wanted to begin today just by re-emphasizing this point from Luther and his commentary regarding the giving of the promise to Abram. So this is Luther. Such is faith. Abram has no land, yet he is promised one. He has no children, yet he will be a great nation. Abram goes forth based solely on God's promise. Luther writes, "This, then, is the mark of the true and divine promise, that they are in conflict with reason, and that reason does not want to accept them, because those of the devil, on the other hand, are in agreement with human reason. They are accepted by reason readily and without hesitation," end quote. So Luther's saying that faith and the promise must go together because these things logically do not make sense. That Abram is 80 years old and he's going to have children, that Abram's going to inherit this land but doesn't have any, and that logically this does not make sense, which is why it must be based on faith and the promise. And we're going to see that whenever Abram gets into trouble, it's because he wants to make things logical, or he wants to be in control of the situation. So we saw that already last week when he was in Egypt. He gets himself into trouble because he wants Sarai to lie about being his sister. He's going to do that again to Abimelech, and again in Egypt he's going to try to pull the same stunt. And in chapter 16 of Genesis, we're going to have this run-in with Hagar. Sarai is not going to trust the promise, so she's going to want to get a child by Hagar. That's going to cause an issue. So the emphasis being that the promise and the faith go together because these things are not what our human understanding wants to understand, or what Abram's human understanding wants to believe, but it has to be based on the promises of God. So that's that. So we were down in Egypt, and so we're going to start today in chapter 13. They're going to come up out of Egypt. So who wants to read? 13 verse 1 to 7.
No, I don't want to read.
Okay.
Can I just add something?
Please.
God doesn't really give very clear instructions. So he said, you'll be a great nation, you have lots of kids, and so Sarah was thinking, well, I'm too old, so God must mean that he's going to have kids through this Hagar.
Yeah.
So God didn't say, don't do it with Hagar, you're going to have kids. So, so also when Abram went into Egypt, he didn't say, well, don't say anything about Sarah being your wife, saying he wasn't specific in his instructions. Yes.
Well,
So he sort of have to guess what God meant to go into Egypt. And then it's like, okay.
well, remember the command was not to go to Egypt. Abram goes to Egypt because there's a famine. So that wasn't a direct instruction from God to go to Egypt, but Abram goes. Not that going to Egypt in itself is sinful. We talked about last week, where's the line? I think you brought up the question, what's the line between doing what you need to do to provide for your family versus, trusting God's promise, specifically in the instance of, having Abram try to save himself and his wife by saying, say that you're my sister and not my wife. So and we see this in our own lives. We want to do God's will for our lives, but there's not, a list that descends from heaven and says, you're going to do this today and that tomorrow. So we have, our sanctified reason, if you want to say, where we do get to make choices about, what we put on or what we wear or who we marry or whatever. I mean, those things aren't directly mandated by God, what we are to do. But what we do, the choices that we make, should be within the confines of what God has said and what his promises are for us. So Abram doesn't have the command, go down to Egypt, but, there's a famine in the land, and Abram knows I have to eat and my wife has to eat, and I know that there's food in Egypt, so we're going to go to Egypt. But you're right that initially the promise does seem rather vague, but we're going to see today, and if not today, next week, where God will continue to specify and clarify his promises to Abram. And so you're right, Sarai maybe is acting in faith, knowing that the promise is to have children, but I can't have children, so he must need to have children through Hagar. Luther will say that Sarai is acting in faith there with that reason that you brought up. But also to your point, with the command being vague, the command or the promise is not given that Abram will have children through Sarai. He tells them that they're going to have a child between the two of them. And so also thinking that, Abram and Sarai are husband and wife, and to have a relationship outside of that that union.
Though, at that time.
Well, so it's accepted maybe culturally, but it's never thought to be a good idea by God. God never commands people to have more than one wife, and people who have more than one wives, that never goes well. I mean, we'll see that with Jacob when we start talking about Jacob. So Abram is only married to Sarai for as long as Sarai is alive, and then Sarah will die, and only after Sarah dies will Abram take another wife. As far as we know, Isaac only has Rebekah for a wife. As far as we know, Adam is only married to Eve. So it's true that we have instances of people with polygamous marriages, such as Jacob, or, everyone always thinks of David and Solomon because they had who knows how many hundreds of wives. But these things are never commanded by God saying, hey, maybe you should have several wives, because that's not the marriage that God ordains in Eden. He ordains one man and one wife to enter into marriage. And so even if it's culturally acceptable at the time, that's not God's command and that's not God's mandate. Christ will talk about marriage in the Gospels, and he says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, singular, and the two will become one flesh. And this is going to happen several times because the man's going to keep getting married and they're going to keep having, these marriages. The marriage as God creates it in Eden is between one man and one wife, and Christ reaffirms that in the Gospels. So this idea of Sarai, this explanation that Sarai is maybe acting in faith, I would say is not the best understanding. Sarai is not trusting that God will give her a child, because God's going to promise to her, you will have a child. And she laughs. She doesn't believe him. So this, and like I said, we'll talk about this, but you're right. The promise as it's given in chapter 12 seems vague. But we're going to see as we go on that God is going to continue to specify this promise and say, it's going to be as many as the dust of the earth, or it's going to be as many as the stars in the heavens. or it's going to come from your own loins. You, Sarai, will have a child. And that is going to be the child of the promise, not Ishmael.
I think the other thing that's hard for us to understand is when we're trying to do the will of God, God doesn't speak to us directly like he did in the Old Testament to Abram and a lot of other people. And so we're still making the decision, trusting that God will, in his providence, make his will be done through us.
Yeah. And, you know, that's Hebrews chapter 1, right? In many and various ways, God spoke to his people of old by the prophets, but now in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. And so we, while the angel of the Lord might not come down and stand bodily in front of us and speak to us, God does continue to speak to us through his word. So we do have that benefit, that we have all of the canonical scriptures written for us, that we can have the whole counsel of God and know that. But you're right, it's not that, like I said, a divine to-do list doesn't drop down out of heaven and say, hey, this is your spouse, this is where you're going to live, this is going to be your occupation. These are sort of things that we do get to have choice in, but that, as I said, those choices are always guided or directed, if you will, within the confines of what God has said to us in his word and spoken to us through his Son. So
God said, here, get to this point, and we're kind of left to our own device to kind of get to that point, but sometimes we
Right.
don't quite get there because, like you said, we don't have a list, like,
yeah.
you know, go over here, turn right, turn left. We're kind of left to our own device to kind of get to where he wants us to go.
Well, and even Pastor speaks this way, and I think this is a very good way of putting it. People will say, I wish God would tell me what his will for my life would be. And that would be very easy, and that would be very nice. And he does do that to effect when he gives us his 10 commandments. This is what I want you to live like. This is what my will is for your life, that you do these things. And how you go about doing these things, well, that's where you get to choose who your spouse is, where you live, what your occupation is. As long as it's within those confines of what God's will is laid out in his 10 commandments and in his word.
Well, isn't it more, we would like specifics,
Yeah,
but the ultimate goal is eternal salvation.
yeah,
And how we get there, we have free will. And so it's a whole different thing, you know, do I take that job, do I not, or do I whatever? And we have, as long as we stick to the 10 commandments and what the word and all that, we will have salvation, which is the only thing that matters.
right. Right, that's I would say that's very good. That's correct. But, you know, I certainly would love to have a specific to-do list. And I would love for God to say,
Don't
you know,
forget that, Jill.
and-
He needs a to-do list.
I'd love for God to say, in 2 years, this is going to be your call, and this is where you're going to go, and this is how long you're going to be there. But that's just not how it shakes out.
I know, and it just reminds me of when Jim and I first came to Naples. Jim wanted to buy an apartment complex down on Thomason Drive, and we didn't have the money, so we asked my dad to go into partnership with us, and he actually came and looked at the property and talked to us, and he went back home and he said, I prayed and I prayed and I prayed, and he said, I haven't been able to sleep since I was in Naples. And as soon as I realized that I wasn't supposed to be part of this, I started sleeping again. So I think that God does speak to us in those kind of ways also.
Sure.
So,
Well, and Jill's grandpa has this phrase that I think is pretty good, that, you know, it's not necessarily always about making the right decision. It's about making the decision right. So, you know, because we often agonize, oh, should I do X or should I do Y? And I don't know, do you want to expound on that anymore? Because he said it to you specifically, but
It's sort of like what Carl has done through the years. There's it's Traeger Kemper, or one of the, no, that's another one. He does the chart and all the factors that are involved, and you grade it on the numbers.
Yeah.
And then that's helpful to, eliminate some things, what is important for your professional life, your personal life, and, and all the other things. And then you come out with a number, and he's done all those things, even about getting married.
I mean, I've done that. I did that about when to
Yeah.
get married.
And, it really is very, very helpful. And then the rest is you pray and you discuss it with the important people in your life, and then you come out with a decision. And we've never really made a bad decision.
Yeah.
But it takes a lot of effort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. This is good. So who does, though, want to start us in chapter 13? And I think we should maybe do verses 1 to 7 just on the outset.
Okay. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negev. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he journeyed on from Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land.
Okay. So famine must be over. So they're going to go back up to Canaan. And so I pulled up this map here, and hopefully we'll keep referring to it throughout the hour and probably as these weeks go by. And it's kind of truncated just on Israel. But if we want to think, so we've got our bodies of water, the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River here. So the Negev is going to be, down here, not quite in the Sinai Peninsula, and Egypt is going to be over here with the Nile splitting off into the Nile Delta. But so the Negev is like right here, kind of south of where it says the wilderness of Edom on that map is where the Negev is.
So are we ever given what the boundaries of what God gave to Abram?
Yes,
Because
in
he-
Joshua,
Okay,
when
because he gave them a lot more than what they have now.
right. So those borders are defined in Joshua when the tribes settle, and then even after that, when David reigns as king, in 2 Samuel, we're given the boundaries of all of the land that the kingdom of Israel has at its height, and those are the specific borders that of the land that God gives. So anyway, So down here is where Negev is, and we see that they go up from the Negev as far as Bethel, which is right here, and here's Ai. So this is about where they're coming up. And so just by way of interest, the people of Israel, when they come out of Egypt during the Exodus, are going to have to go all the way around this way because they're going to be on the opposite side of Jericho at the Jordan River, and Abram just goes straight up. So there's that. Interestingly, he goes back where? Where does he want to go when he comes back to the land?
That's where you'd been at the beginning.
Where he'd been at the beginning, because why? What's there?
An altar?
Because that's where the altar is. So if you will, Abram's life now is centered around his tent and his altar. He always wants to be where either he has built an altar or where he's going to build an altar. The altar is very important to Abraham. Not necessarily that we already have sacrifices instituted, but Abram knows that he is supposed to be at a specific location to worship the Lord, and that location is the altar. So this is why, it's in our nature as Christians to have an altar where we worship, because this is how it has always been when God is worshiped. He is worshiped at his holy altar, wherever that is.
So he's back, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
So
please.
he's back to where he
Back-
was when the Lord talked to him?
Yeah, back before they went down to Egypt, they're going back to the same place.
Okay.
So this is home base, as it were.
Because I'm going back to 12, it says, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." So that's like,
So that's already before they get to Canaan.
okay.
So that's-
It didn't say where to go, though.
Right, just to where I show you. And then they end up where,
Right.
where they're supposed to be. So back there in 12, he's in Haran, which we said is all the way,
Was that where God told him to go?
where they ended up in Bethel and near Ai. Yes.
Okay.
So he's going back to the altar where he was at the first place, and he calls upon the name of the Lord. So this is just re-emphasizing that he's left the pagan idol worship of his father when they were in Haran, and he is worshiping only the Lord.
So why did he go back? I'm sorry. I'm a little confused.
So
God
he's-
said go, but now he's like right back where he started.
Well, because God told him to go here.
Okay.
In this place, because this is going to become the promised land. And he went to Egypt only because there was a famine.
Right.
Because
Not
God,
at God's direction.
not at God's specific command, but
Okay.
practically because there was a famine. And now that the famine's over, he knows he needs to go back to this land because this is the land God told him to go to. Because this is the promised land. This is the land that God's going to give him.
Okay, so it wasn't where he started then.
No, he
Not
started
exactly,
he
sorry,
started
yeah.
up in
You
Haran.
had missed, but yeah,
All right.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I got you. Yeah, no. Okay, we're good.
Okay.
It was slightly confusing for a second, but
Okay.
we got it now.
And so what's the issue that they run into? They're back here in the promised land where Abram's told he's supposed to be because this is the land that's going to be given him.
So the livestock are
There's too much livestock.
to support the,
Abram and Lot both are so wealthy that their livestock are so large that they're running into this issue where Lot's sheep are getting mixed up with Abram's sheep and it's causing an issue. So remember, they're down in Egypt, and Pharaoh, instead of getting Abram in trouble because he lied to him, instead blesses him with livestock and wealth and all of this other stuff. So this is God's miraculous provision for him, not because he did anything, but because God has promised to bless him. And he has blessed him and Lot so much that there's so much wealth that they're getting into trouble because it's getting all mixed up. Okay, so I said all that. Yeah, returns with wife and property acquired by God's gracious giving and protection. Okay, good. So who wants to read for us verse 8 through 13?
Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, I will go to the right, and if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land in Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord.
Okay, so there's a practical problem. Abram's going to give a practical solution. Look, all of this land is before us. Why don't you take you and yourself and take a chunk of land, and wherever you go, I'll give the opposite. So commentators haggle on whether or not this is Abram flippantly offering the land to Lot as if it's not important, or is this Abram acting in faith that no matter which section of the land he offers to Lot, the Lord will still give him the entirety of the land? I tend to think that this is Abram acting in faith and in humility, saying to Lot, I know that the Lord will give me what he has promised, so you do as you seem best, and I will take that which you do not. So he's trusting that God will deliver what he has promised. Interesting comparison that the plain of the Jordan is compared to the garden of the Lord, which is a direct reference to the Garden of Eden. So Lot looks out and he says, hey, this land looks very nice, it's well watered, it's fertile, it's good for planting and all that. So he takes that which looks pleasing to the sight and to the eyes. And so Sodom and Gomorrah are down here, sort of to the south and east of the Dead Sea, sort of here. And they're not on the map anymore, Moses helpfully tells us, because they got destroyed. So we're going to read about that in chapters 18 and 19, but you don't see them on the map anymore because they don't exist anymore because God destroyed them.
Do you know that they have uncovered evidence?
I have seen that, though, that they've uncovered evidence that they did exist, so that people will say, see, the Bible's not true because Sodom and Gomorrah aren't on the
Right.
map anymore. And we say, well, give me a break because, number one, God destroyed them, so did a pretty good job in doing it because you can't find it, but we actually do have archaeological teams who have found remains now, so that's pretty neat. Biblical archaeology is always fascinating. And so so Lot chooses this land because it looks good to the eyes, but we already get a sense of that this is going to turn into trouble now with verse 13, because the men of Sodom are wicked and great sinners. Even in this pagan context, they are known as notorious sinners, which you got to be pretty bad if everybody around you is pagan and heathen, but you're the one who gets called really bad sinners. That's not so good. So Lot selfishly then takes advantage of Abram's offer and takes what seems to be good for himself. But verse 13 is foreshadowing the trouble that Lot's going to get himself into in Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay. So let's go on then. Verses 14 through 17 then is good. That'll take us to the end of the chapter.
Okay. The
Or 18.
The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord.
Okay. So it looks like Lot is getting the better end of the deal, but while Abram is here between Bethel and Ai, God tells him, so in a sense, he's right smack dab in the middle of the promised land. And what does he say? He specifies his promise. He says, from where you are, look northward and southward and eastward and westward. All of this land I will give you. So it's not just this little little piece of ground here. It's not just Shechem, where you were once before, but I'm going to give you all this land, all that you can see. And like Claudia asked, the specifics of these boundaries are given in 2 Samuel when the reign of King David is established, when the kingdom of Israel is at its height.
There's people living there.
There are people living there. So that's another element of the
Yeah.
promise then. The people are here, but I promise you I'm going to give it to you. These people that are here will be driven out, and they'll be driven out at my hand and at my command. Because this is your land, I've promised it to you. And this is where, another element of faith comes in, that God says, I'm going to give you this land. And Abram looks around and he says, there's a bunch of people here. What are you talking about? But he trusts God's promise that God has said he will give me this land. I promise I have faith that he will keep this promise and give it to me. And so here's our dust of the earth clarification. All the land that you see. Oh, because this is right. Back in verse 12 then, or chapter 12, he is in Shechem, and maybe this is just back in chapter 12, he thinks maybe this land, it's vague. Maybe it's just Shechem that he's going to get. But he says, no, he further defines and specifies the promise, and he says, all the land that you see, northward, southward, eastward, westward, all of this land, with more specificity, he says, I will give you this land. And your descendants, not just a great nation, will be as many as the dust of the earth, which of course cannot be counted. So he moves his tent and he settles down here in Hebron, which is sort of south and a little bit west of Bethlehem and Jerusalem, here at Hebron. And Hebron is going to become very important because this is where Abram's going to buy a cave from the people living in this land, and that's where he's going to bury Sarah. He's going to be buried there. Isaac and Jacob are going to be buried at Hebron. And when David is anointed king of Israel, he's going to be anointed at Hebron. So this is a very important place, and this is going to be, if you will, a covenant landmark. This is where the patriarchs are. This is where David is established as king, and this is where Abram lives. So Hebron, big important place. Let's see. Oh, and so, back thinking about Lot, this maybe shows us or gives us an insight to what he thinks is important. He wants what is worldly and perhaps not caring about the dangers of living in this morally corrupt area in Sodom and Gomorrah, because what's more important to him is this earthly wealth and prestige and all of that. The evil of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is already infamous notwithstanding. Okay, any questions on chapter 13? All right, then let's move on then to chapter 14. We get some interesting, we should also understand or also recognize the importance of this last line in verse 18. What does he do? He gets to Hebron by the oaks of Mamre, and what does he do? The first thing he does when he gets there,
Builds an altar.
he builds an altar to the Lord. So Abram will not go without the regular worship of the Lord. He and his household will always have an altar where they are. This is what's most important to Abram. Okay, so chapter 14, who wants to read? Let's do verses 14 through 12, I suppose, is fine.
14,
One through
verse 1.
Chapter 14.
Chapter
You want
14, 1 through.
See, you all know what I mean.
Sure, yeah.
Who's gonna want to read
got a
that?
lot
They
of
have all the
names
weird
in it.
names.
Oh, yeah, I don't know all those.
Okay, I'll read it.
Claudia's
I
brain.
could
We
read
used-
it,
we
and then you
used-
could just do this.
We used to have to practice these things when I was a kid. In the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, these kings made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. And all these four joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Raphaim in Ashtoreth, Karnaim, and Zuzim in Ham, and Emim in Shavra Kiriathaim, and the Horites in their hill country of Sire, as far as El Paran on the border of the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and defeated all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who were willing in Harazon Tamar.
Read that again.
You're a good sport, Claudia. Thank you. So, okay, I'll read then 8 to 12. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Amda, and the king of Zeboim, the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out, and they joined battle in the valley of Siddim with Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goyim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. Some fell into them, and the rest fled into the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their provisions, and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. So this is the first time that biblical events are expressly coordinated with extra-biblical history. So this helps us to root and ground the historicity of Scripture with the rest of history. So we know that the Bible contains history, but that the Bible itself is not primarily a history book. It's the story of salvation. But the facticity of salvation is rooted in this extra-biblical history that we do have archaeological evidence for. These kings are not so easily identified with sort of the ancient Near East history, but nevertheless, we have these instances where events in the lives of the prophets are linked to certain earthquakes or the reigns of certain kings. I mean, we have all kinds of Babylonian archaeology that we can link to Nebuchadnezzar and the time of Daniel. So this is the first of those instances where extra-biblical history is linked to the biblical narrative. So that's interesting to point out. The other thing that's interesting to point out is that these are all sort of vassal states, as it were, or city-states. So each of these cities has a king. This isn't sprawling territory. The city of Sodom has a king. The city of Gomorrah has a king, and they rule over these cities, and so these are city-states, as it were. And they all are paying tribute to this Chedorlaomer guy, and they decide that they're going to stop doing that, so this war arises. And it's 5 people, or 5 kings against 4, so you would think that they'd have a numerical advantage and beat out over the people they're going to rebel against, but they don't. These 4 kings wipe out the 5 and take all their goods. And Lot is part of the spoil that gets taken away. So Lot thinks that he's getting the better end of the deal because all of this looks really good to human eyes, but already he's in trouble because he got himself mixed up in this conflict, and he's already being taken as a prisoner of war, and all that he had has been taken away as
Plunder.
tribute or plunder. Thank you. Okay. So who wants to take verse 13 through 16? There aren't as many strange names in this passage, so be brave.
I'll try.
All right.
Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and Aner. These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot, with his possessions, and the women and the people.
Okay. So Sodom and Gomorrah are down here, if we remember, and all of these other, city-states are around the promised land, if you will, sort of on the east side, surrounding all around. And so they've lost their rebellion, if you will, and they're being taken up all the way up here is Dan, far north of the Sea of Galilee, and up towards Damascus even. So Abram hears about this and goes all the way from Hebron, which is down here, south of Jerusalem, and goes all the way up towards Dan and Damascus here. And with some allies that he's made, presumably living around him here, south in Hebron, he goes up and with 318 men does what five kings cannot. So if you think 5 kings and all of their armies, they should be able to take down 4 kings and their armies, and they do not. They get totally taken over. But Abram, with 318 men, defeats these 4 kings. So this is a sign of God's miraculous working and being on the side of Abram. So why don't we then turn to 1 Samuel 17, verse 45. And this is what David is going to say to Goliath when he comes out to face him. So let's see. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses, let's see, 45 through 47. Who wants to read that for us?
Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." Are we going to 46 or 47?
47, please.
Okay. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with a sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand.
Yeah, so good. So that's David talking to Goliath, but the principle is the same, right? I mean, it seems impossible that 318 men should be able to do what 5 kings cannot. But certainly they can when the battle is the Lord's, and it is the Lord who fights for his people, and it is the Lord who will give his enemies into the hands of his people.
So we're assuming that, it sounds like these kingdoms are teensy tiny.
Right, so they're
I
not...
don't know how many people are in each of these were
It-
fighting?
right.
Were they more than 300? Were they tens of thousands?
We're assuming that they're more than 300, but they're certainly not, the size of Babylon at its height. These are more city-state type of kingdoms. But presumably they each have more than 300 men fighting with them, which is why this is so miraculous.
But verse 15 also says, and he divided his forces against them by night.
So presumably he
So-
has more than 318 men at the beginning, but only goes in with 318.
Okay, but when they attack at night, you surprise the enemy,
advantage.
and that will give you an advantage.
Right. But still, if you're only attacking with 318 men, and presumably there's more of them, that's still, the emphasis is that it is the Lord who does this for them.
But just think about Jonathan when he and his servant or whoever, and they yelled out to the Philistines, and Jonathan said, if they say this, we'll let them come to us, and if they say this, we'll go up.
Right.
And they slaughtered everybody.
Right.
So, I mean, that's what happens when you put your,
When your trust is in the
Yeah,
Lord and not in
right.
your numerical advantage, right?
right.
I mean, that happens to Hezekiah. The Syrians come up and are besieging Jerusalem, and everyone is eating horses and thinking they're all going to die. And then the angel of the Lord comes and kills 185,000 of the Syrians, and they have to run away. Because always the battle is the Lord's, and it is the Lord who gives the enemies of his people into their hands.
Yeah.
So, good. And notice, so Lot is brought back with all his possessions, back with his kinsmen and all his possessions and the women and the people. All right. You've got 5 minutes. Let's read verse 17 through 24, and I'll make some quick comments, and we can go back and talk about this more next week if we need to.
After his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshol, and Mamre take their share.
Okay. So, Abram's in Hebron. He goes up to Dan in Damascus and takes care of business, as it were, or the Lord takes care of business on their behalf. And so they're going back down to this King's Valley, which is presumably near Jerusalem, which is all the way now back down here towards the top of the Dead Sea, west of the top of the Dead Sea here in Jerusalem. And this figure shows up, Melchizedek, king of Salem, and Salem is Jerusalem. Salem is coming to us from the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace. So Melchizedek is the king of Jerusalem, which means he is the king of peace. And his name means king of righteousness, coming to us from the Hebrew. Melchi. Tzedek. So, Hebrew, you have to read right to left. So, Melchi is here. This is from the Hebrew word for Melech, which is king, and Zedek means righteousness. So, Zedekiah is coming from Zedek. That's really all I think I need to say. But anyway, so it's interesting. The king of Jerusalem is the king of peace. He's the king of righteousness. He is both king and priest of God Most High, so he holds both of these offices. He is, and we know he is the priest of the true God because the blessing that he speaks to Abram, Abram says something very similar to the king of Sodom, that God Most High is the possessor of heaven and earth. He comes out to Abram with bread and with wine. If you want to see some sort of Eucharistic connection to this, I would not say that this itself is the Lord's Supper, but if you don't see shadows of the Lord's Supper in this, I would encourage you to see shadows of the Lord's Supper in this. Melchizedek as a figure is interesting. We've got Psalm 110, which speaks about the Lord saying to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Jesus will ask the Pharisees who David's son is, and they say, we don't know. And he says to them, how does, well, okay, so here's the quotation, Matthew 22:44. Jesus asked them, saying, what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? And they said to him, the son of David. And he said, how then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool? If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son? So if the fourth commandment is honor your father and mother, why is it that the father here, David, is honoring his son, calling him Lord? And Jesus' point is that his son is the Lord. It's him. He's come to be the Lord. And he shows up that here in Psalm 110. A psalm of David, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord shall send the rod of your strength out of Zion to rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people shall be volunteers in the day of your power, and the beauties of holiness from the womb of the morning. This is a literal translation from the Hebrew, the womb of the morning, the very early morning. You have the dew of your youth. The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He shall execute kings in the days of his wrath. So, the Lord, speaking to David's Lord, which is David's son, who he is honoring with the title Lord, he is saying that the Lord, oh man, this is getting confusing.
And that passage always has been confusing.
The Lord said to my Lord, that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. That one's pretty fun. It is.
That's why the diagram.
Okay, so the Lord, capital O-L-O-R-D, which is Yahweh,
Right.
So that's God. That's pretty impressive.
the Lord said to my Lord, this is David, and David is honoring his son with the title Lord. So this is the Lord, this is Yahweh saying it to David's son. Sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. And the Lord, Yahweh, is saying to David's son, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So that's interesting. We're already out of time. I'm going to talk maybe till 11:15. And we're probably going to have to talk about this more next week. But, so, Melchizedek is a figure that's interesting. He gets talked about more in Hebrews 7. Melchizedek does not have a genealogy, and his death is not recorded in Scripture. And think about that. If you're a king and you don't have any genealogy recorded, normally that would put your reign in jeopardy because who you are as king depends on who your parents were. I mean, Charles III is only the king because his mother was Queen Elizabeth. And she was only the queen because her father was the king of England. So if your reign and your dynasty is going to be established, you need to have a genealogy that you can point to. And I mean, in the Middle Ages, you had all of these wars because all of these people were claiming to be the king and they had claim to the kingship through whoever their third cousin's first aunt twice removed was. And so you had the War of the Roses and all that nonsense. So anyway, it's interesting that Melchizedek has no genealogy recorded, and his death is never recorded. It's also interesting that he is a priest, but he's not a Levite. Because the Levitical line is the priestly line, and the writer of the Hebrews says that, Levi is still in Abram's loin at this point, meaning, Levi hasn't been born yet, but the one from whom Levi will come, Abram, is honoring Melchizedek with a tithe. So that's interesting because Abram is supposed to be head honcho number one in Israelite thought, obviously, because he's Father Abraham. But Father Abraham is acknowledging this Melchizedek as someone greater than even he is. So that's interesting. So people will sometimes think that maybe this is the pre-incarnate Christ. Some will think that this is Noah's son Shem, who has dwelt in this land, and Shem maybe is still alive right now, so maybe he has been given this title, the King of Righteousness, or maybe this is actually an individual with the name Melchizedek. We're not quite sure, but this is all very interesting to consider that in this messianic Psalm 110, that Christ is our king and our priest, but he is our priest not from the line of Levi, but from the line of Judah, which is why he is a priest forever, as Melchizedek then is a priest forever because he has no genealogy and no record of his death. And Christ is priest after the order of Melchizedek because Melchizedek is not from the Levitical line, the Levitical priesthood. So just as Christ is not from the line of Levi and yet a priest, we've seen this before in this figure Melchizedek.
Also interesting then that he's like the king of peace and the king of righteousness.
Right. So, and peace and righteousness throughout the Old Testament define the kingdom of the Messiah. We see this all the time in the Psalms that righteousness and peace are closely connected. And that whenever the prophets speak of the coming of the kingdom of the Messiah, it is defined by righteousness and by peace. And so the first king of Israel, then, to sit on Melchizedek's throne is who?
David?
David. And it's David to whom the Lord gives the promise that one of your seed will sit on the throne forever.
What is the timeline? Because you just said that the son of, or the Shem, you mentioned Shem,
Yeah.
that he might still be alive when this is all going on with
Yeah,
Abram.
I
What
wanted
is-
to look
so
at a
what is the
timeline.
Yeah,
But after the flood, we have a recounting of all of Shem's sons. And Shem lives 500 years after he fathers those children, and then he dies. So it's possible, if you look at that chronology that I believe is in, well, I don't know what chapter it's in. But if you look at that chronology, it's possible, if you tabulate it in a certain way, that Shem is still alive at this time.
I'm going to give a study Bible.
Okay, good. So we've got this figure, Melchizedek, who probably deserves his own Bible study in his own right. I would direct you towards Hebrews chapter 7 to read more about Melchizedek and the tie that the writer of the Hebrews makes with Christ being king and priest, but that his kingdom and that his priesthood supersedes that of the Levitical priesthood, much like Melchizedek does not come from the Levitical line. And we see those shadows, if you will, that's what I want to call them, of the Eucharist in him bringing Abram bread and wine. So there's that. Okay, so thus far, Melchizedek. So this is also interesting that Melchizedek blesses Abram. And remember back in chapter 12, we have the promise that God will bless Abram. So this is the first time that Abram is being blessed. We can understand this as God blessing Abram through Melchizedek. And Melchizedek has the right to bless because he is a priest of God Most High. So here we have God working through his priest, Melchizedek, to bless Abram in this way. So God is continuing to fulfill his promise that he will bless Abram, and he's blessing Abram through this figure Melchizedek. Okay, we've got regulations for tithing first coming up in Deuteronomy, associated with the worship of the one true God, associated with agriculture, with being charitable. Please.
So in verse 20, it says Abram gave him a tenth of everything.
Yeah.
Is that like time?
Yeah, this is the tithing business, giving a tenth that we've got. So this is confirmation of the legitimacy of Melchizedek's kingship and priesthood, that he is truly priest of God Most High because Abram acknowledges him as such in giving him a tithe. And what he says to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord God Most High, which is what Melchizedek identifies God as, the possessor of heaven and earth. Possessor of heaven and earth. So that's the blessing that Melchizedek gives to Abram, uses that title for God, and then Abram uses that title when talking to the king of Sodom, which is a further confirmation that Abram is worshiping the same God that Melchizedek is the priest of. So, notice also the difference between the offerings of Melchizedek to Abram and the king of Sodom to Abram, and the gift and the blessing that Abram accepts. Abram accepts the blessing and the gifts that seem rather humble from Melchizedek, while saying thank you but no thank you to the king of Sodom. And why does he do that? What does he say in verse 23? Why is he not going to accept the gift of the king of Sodom?
I don't want anything that's worse.
Yeah, but why not? Lest you should say,
I made him rich.
yeah,
So he doesn't want him to take the credit?
right. He doesn't want the king of Sodom to think that Abram is indebted to him for anything. Abram's not indebted to the king of Sodom because all that Abram has, the Lord has given him. So he's willing to take what Melchizedek gives him, the blessing, and these humble things of bread and wine, because Abram knows that the Lord has given him these things through his priest and king Melchizedek. But he is not going to be like Lot and take the wealth of the king of Sodom, although it seems to be greater than what Melchizedek has to offer, these earthly things, because Abram knows that it is the Lord who is going to bless and give him all that he has, and he does not want the king of Sodom to think that he has had any part in Abram's prestige or wealth or prominence, because Abram knows that he's not going to get his wealth or the things that he has from the world or the things of this world. He knows he's going to get them from the Lord and from the Lord's provision. So we see this difference between Abram and Lot. Lot wants to take the things that look worldly and abundant to this world, and that gets him into trouble. It gets him to be a prisoner of war and all of the things that he has to be plunder. Abram puts his trust in the Lord, and with fewer men overwhelms 4 kings, and he accepts the blessing from God and God's emissary Melchizedek, and not the worldly blessings of the king of Sodom.
Okay.
And I stopped a minute before I thought I was going to stop. Are there any other questions of what we talked about today?
Okay, the timeline in the Lutheran Study Bible dates Abraham at 2166 BC.
Yep.
And it says that flood accounts in various world cultures describe a great worldwide flood. And then it also says, although writing had begun at an earlier date, Sumerian records of commerce may date to about 3300 BC.
Yeah, so already pre-flood. Because if
The
the, or
3300.
pre-Abraham, excuse me, pre-Abraham.
Yeah. And recorded history began when Egyptians used hieroglyphics to describe the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt
Yeah.
under Menes in 3100 BC. After this point, it becomes possible to calculate dates for persons and events, though many difficulties still result because of the variety of calendars, writing systems, and styles used by ancient people.
Yeah, which is why I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Melchizedek has to be Shem, because I don't know, because
Right,
these dates are
right.
hard to pin down specifically. But this is a pious opinion that Luther held because Luther's teachers held it, and it was already then a long-standing tradition of the church. So it may be, it doesn't have to be.
Right, and in the hieroglyphics in Egypt, there is evidence of that worldwide flood also.
Right,
Yeah,
yeah.
so,
Okay,
Abram doesn't like king of Sodom.
I think that Abram at least is wary of the king of Sodom because his reputation as king over this very wicked city precedes him. And even more so now, he's wary of him because he can't even hold his own in battle. So Abram knows not to put his trust in the king of Sodom because the king of Sodom just was a prisoner of war not 2 seconds ago. And all of his worldly wealth got him nowhere. So he doesn't like, he doesn't trust.
But later on, he tried to save.
Yeah, later on he tries to save Sodom and Gomorrah for the sake of Lot. Yeah. So even though he doesn't like them, he prays on their behalf. So that's interesting too when we think of Christ's command to pray for your enemies. So, all right, good. So we're going to continue next week. We'll look at least chapters 15 and 16, so I would encourage you to read those beforehand. Are there any other
I have it at
questions,
lunch.
thoughts, or comments before we adjourn for today? Okay, well then let us close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll see you next week.
What is it?
It's bread, there's a little piece of flour that